What is wisdom? Not intelligence, but wisdom. I'm sure many of you have made enough D&D characters over the years to understand the difference theoretically, but what does this look like in practice? I made a post on the channel asking about it recently, and everyone's response was a little different, of course, but I think if we boil it down, the core of just about everyone's reply was that it's some combination of practical knowledge and life experience. Each of my parents told me something similar, which is interesting considering they've been separated for nearly 20 years now and don't really want to have anything to do with each other. And when I asked my brother, he said, quote, "Get back to work, lazy bum." Thought-provoking stuff. Thanks, little bro. Knowledge and experience is a great place to start, but I think there's more to it than that. And it's why wisdom can be such a difficult topic to pin down. If you were to boil down the traits of wisdom, what might they be? Someone who's capable, loyal, dedicated, caring, confident. Maybe it's someone who has a strong sense of empathy, born from a wide variety of lives lived. Someone who will fight when necessary, but who prefers a peaceful resolution. Someone who doesn't always have the answers, but can help you find them yourself. Who can you think of that fits these traits? Unfortunately, I'm having difficulty thinking of a living person everyone will know about, so instead we'll turn to fiction. For me, there are two figures that come to mind when I think of true wisdom: Captain Jean-Luc Picard and Uncle Iroh. Both of these men have knowledge and experience, of course, but that knowledge was sometimes born from major mistakes. Picard nearly died as a young man after being stabbed through the heart by a surly Nausicaan over a game of Domjot, and Uncle Iroh lost his only son at the siege of Ba Sing Se. Each of these moments completely changed the trajectory of these characters' lives, but they had a wealth of other experiences as well that sculpted their character. For Picard, he rescued an ambassador on Malika III, he assumed command of the USS Stargazer after her captain was killed, he fought in the Cardassian Wars, made the difficult decision to abandon the Stargazer after a battle with the Ferengi, invented the Picard maneuver, both of them, and so much more. These difficult moments, combined with his Starfleet Academy training, sculpted him into the confident, capable, wise individual we meet during TNG's run. For Iroh, he was the assumed heir to his father, Fire Lord Azulon, and as such would have been crowned as ruler of the Fire Nation. He was pressured into military service, where he served as a general of the Fire Nation army for many years. He embraced this role, but it clearly took a toll on him. He aged more quickly than his brother Ozai. It was the death of his son that finally made him realize the heavy cost of war and of all his military expeditions. The unbelievable heartache he felt was something he'd inflicted upon countless others throughout his life. His journey through the spirit world after the death of his father and Ozai's accession to the throne instead of Iroh helped him change his outlook on life. Rather than pursuing a blind quest for power and might, it was more important for one to appreciate their life and the people in it. Both of them serve as mentors as well. Iroh to Prince Zuko, of course, and Picard to Data and to Wesley Crusher. These mentees provide an opportunity to impart their knowledge rather than just demonstrate it. So, broadly speaking, their wisdom still comes from knowledge and experience, but I think there's something we miss in simplifying the definition so much. In the ancient Mediterranean, we can find similar ideas. There are a number of different figures in classical mythology considered to be wise. Athena, Apollo, and Chiron the centaur come to mind. But nobody, I think, demonstrates wisdom as well as Teiresias. Having lived a liminal life, Teiresias was considered to have a wide range of knowledge and experience. They straddled the worlds of the living and the dead, the present and the future, the blind and the seeing, mortals and immortals, and of course, women and men. Today we're going to look at the myths of Teiresias. We've talked about them before, twice, and at this point I figure it would be disrespectful to kick their myths down the curb yet again. So yeah, it's Teiresias time. Born one gender, Teiresias was transformed into the other by the gods and then back again. How? Why? And what does the story mean? That's what we're going to explore today. But before we get further into it, I want to take a moment to thank the sponsor of this video. Me. I'm a voice feminization coach. You might have noticed the voice that reads the primary sources on this channel is very different from the one you're hearing right now. That's actually my old voice. Or at least it's something close to it. My mom says that's not how I sounded, but either way, yeah, that's me. Every voice you've heard on this channel, up until this video at least, has been my own. Who knows what's going to happen in the future. I worked hard to feminize my own voice, and then had a mentor who taught me how to help others train their voices too. So if you're a trans woman and you're not happy with your voice, I'm here to help. You'll find my email on the channel's description. Drop me a line and let's book a session. The first one is free, and then after that, I offer a pretty broad sliding scale. Also, like, comment, subscribe, Patreon, buy my book, etc. I hate this junk, I really do. I didn't start this channel to be a marketer, but it's hard to exist in this world, eh? Gotta get those Enarees. Teiresias' mythology means a lot to trans people, of course, and it might be interesting to explore this subject from a euhemerist perspective, like we did with Hermaphroditus, in another video, someday. Instead, we're going to explore the story of Teiresias from a mythological perspective. We'll take a look at what it means in the narrative, how we can piece together the various different Teiresias mythographers into a coherent figure, and from there explore what it can mean to modern trans people. Of course, Teiresias isn't strictly transgender in the traditional sense. Their transformation is a magical one. But trans people love magical gender transformations. And I'm not just talking about the one anime you saw when you were a kid that made you feel a whole bunch of gender feels that you'd spend the next decade trying to suppress. One of the main plots in Jurassic Park revolves around the dinosaurs being able to magically switch genders in order to reproduce as well. This one right here, Trans Icon.
But that's not magical gender transformation, that's science, and science fiction is different than magic.
If you really think we spliced dinosaur DNA with frog DNA to fill in the gaps and now our dinosaurs can swap genders is science, I don't know what to tell you. It's really no different than if we reverse the polarity of the deflector disk, we can induce the tachyon field to create an inverse warp bubble. The point is, magical gender transformations are a popular trope in fiction. If you're perverse enough to browse the TV tropes page on it, you'll find hundreds of examples. And that's not just true for the modern world either. There's Cyproites, who was transformed into a woman, somehow, in some way. Hermaphroditus has a magical transformation too, if you read Ovid's version. Now we're exploring Teiresias. Without further ado. Chapter 1. But I thought this was a transgender history channel. Why are you talking about mythology so much on a history channel? Hypocrisy much? Trans history debunked. Before I answer this question, I have a confession to make. I'm not actually a historian. I've been out there for the past few years making videos on transgender history, but history isn't actually my background. I'm a classicist. When I did my undergrad, I did minor in history, but my main area of focus was in classical studies. When I did my undergrad, I did minor in history, but my main area of focus was in classical studies. And no, that has nothing to do with music. It's the study of classical antiquity, roughly the 8th century BCE to the 5th century CE. Sometimes classicists will delve into areas prior to the 8th century BCE, like the Bronze Age or pre-Hellenistic Egypt, but that's not the primary focus.
But that's history, you're studying history.
History is a big part of it, of course, but that's not all there is to it. For example, remember when we explored the Enaree grave from Bactria? That was archaeology. Or when we looked at Lucian's dialogues of the courtesans? That was language and literary analysis. I've also drawn extensively on my admittedly limited knowledge of Latin while researching these videos. None of this is history, strictly speaking. You thought you'd been learning about history this whole time. Ha! It was all a ruse. Just like when you were a little baby and your parents tricked you into eating your broccoli by putting it in something that tasted better. Ha! You've been getting a more well-rounded transsexual education. Eat your anthropology, damn it, it's good for you. So the field of classical studies is about so much more than just history. It's language, literature, archaeology, mythography, art history, philosophy, anthropology, sociology, political science, geography, and so much more. But maybe history is your primary area of interest, and you think it's boring to explore mythology. That's fair. But have you seen the video on Hermaphroditus? We viewed it through the lens of euhemerism, an approach that assumes myths have a grain of truth to them and become more outlandish and more convoluted the more they get passed around. We looked at how the myth of Hermaphroditus could possibly have reflected reality, and we actually did find some evidence of the existence of intersex people in classical antiquity. Because of course mythological stories don't exist in a vacuum. They're products of the societies in which they were created. So when we explore these stories, we end up gaining a better understanding of the people who wrote them, their values, their biases, their ideas. This can help us better understand how they might have seen things like gender roles, and how it might have looked to transgress them within their societies. But there's more to it than that. Today, we consider mythology and history to be two different fields, but the ancients didn't necessarily see it that way. The Roman historian Titus Livius, or just Livy, wrote during the age of Augustus. His work, called Ab Urbe Condita, from the founding of the city, chronicles the rise of the Roman state from a meaningless podunk town to an empire spanning the Mediterranean. He wrote 142 volumes of it, and today, unfortunately, only 35 of them survive. Books 1 to 10 and 21 to 45, as well as some fragments of others. Livy begins Book 1 by talking about how overwhelmed he feels by the enormous task before him. Then he drops this banger, quote, "Events before Rome was born or thought of have come to us in old tales with more of the charm of poetry than of a sound historical record, and such traditions I propose neither to affirm nor refute. There is no reason, I feel, to object when antiquity draws no hard line between the human and the supernatural. It adds dignity to the past, and if any nation deserves the privilege of claiming a divine ancestry, that nation is our own. And so great is the glory won by the Roman people in their wars that when they declare that Mars himself was their first parent and father of the man who founded their city, all the nations of the world might well allow the claim as readily as they accept Rome's imperial dominion." The man who founded their city, mythologically speaking, is Romulus. But before he talks about that, Livy gets into the wanderings of the Trojan hero Aeneas, the son of Venus, after the destruction of Troy. Virgil's Aeneid provides a much more detailed account of it, but the TLDR is that the Greeks destroyed Troy during the Trojan War, but the hero Aeneas escaped with a bunch of survivors, built a fleet of ships, sailed around the Mediterranean looking for a place to call home, and ended up in Latium. There, they fought some battles, united with the local Latins, and established the city of Lavinium. Aeneas' son Ascanius left and founded Alba Longa. I want to stress that none of this is historical fact. It is pure mythology. But it is written in a history book. The very first line of this text says, quote, "The task of writing a history of our nation from Rome's earliest days fills me, I confess, with some misgiving." The very first sentence of this text refers to itself as a history of Rome. Anyway, he continues telling us about a long line of begetting, very biblical, very mindful, before getting to Rhea Silvia. She's the daughter of Numitor, who was one of the descendants of Aeneas and the rightful king of Alba Longa, who was overthrown. All of Rhea Silvia's brothers were killed, and she was forced to become a Vestal Virgin, a sort of like a nun, so she'd never have children herself to challenge the usurper. But Mars showed up and impregnated her with twin boys, which is obviously not something that should happen to sworn virgins. So when the babies were born, the usurper king threw them into the Tiber River and imprisoned Rhea Silvia. The boys floated along the river and found a she-wolf who provided them with milk and cared for them until a farmer found them and raised them as his own. I'd like to take this opportunity once more to draw your attention to the fact that this is written in a history book. I offer now as the opportunity for you to tell me that mythology has nothing to do with history. From there, they did a bunch of stuff and eventually founded the city of Rome. While Romulus was building the city's walls, Remus pointed out that they were too short. Anyone could just jump over them. So in response, Romulus pulls out his sword and murders his brother and says that's what will happen to anyone who tries it. Kind of an overreaction, but hey, who among us hasn't wanted to murder a family member over something petty? Haven't you ever wanted to grab a steak knife and run your racist uncle through at a Christmas dinner? Anyway, that's why it's called Rome and not Reem. Credit for that joke goes to Dr. Martin Beckman, who taught Roman numismatics during my undergrad. Funny guy. Anyway, it all seems absurd, doesn't it? But this is something that happens in the modern world as well. Think of the founding myths around your own country. Maybe they're not as extravagant as the ones that the Romans had, but then again, the legend of King Arthur has some pretty wild stuff in it too. National mythologies are a big part of nationalism, and social conflict emerges when the contradictions between reality and that national mythology become more obvious. Sometimes these national myths are much more fantastical, like the one with Rome's founders, but sometimes they're more subtle. Here in Canada, one of our national myths is that we're nice, polite, progressive people. America's cooler brother, who will let you smoke pot with him in the back of his van while you listen to Rush and the Guess Who. We're the kindler, gentler ones. But if you ask the First Nations peoples of this land, they might disagree. See, here in Canada, we had a system called the Indian residential schools. If you're familiar with this topic, you probably know where I'm going with this. But if you're not, warning that we're about to discuss some pretty nasty stuff. The Indian residential schools were a program of systematic abuse and cultural genocide perpetrated against the First Nations people of Canada. First Nations children were taken from their families and forced to attend these schools, where they were systematically abused, stripped of their culture, and forced to assimilate into the dominant white Anglo-Saxon settler colonial culture. They were forbidden from speaking their languages. They had to speak either French or English. They had to convert to Christianity. They had their heads shaved. They had no contact with their families of origin. They were segregated based on sex. They had to endure racist insults and forced labor in the cold, and a whole lot more that's far more terrible than what we already talked about. Many children didn't survive. This abuse was well known, and so were the deaths, but a lot of these children just never came home, so their families never knew what happened. It's just awful. It's estimated that around 150,000 Indigenous children were kidnapped and sent to these facilities. I don't even want to call them schools. That makes them sound a lot less terrible than they were. The first one opened in 1831. Canada wasn't even a country at that point. Unless you think this is ancient history, so to speak. The last residential school closed in 1996. Like, Tom Holland was born that year. The Nintendo 64 came out that year. Scream came out that year. Prodigy released Firestarter that year. The Windows operating system existed. There are people younger than I am who would have been taken there. It wasn't that long ago. If you're not Canadian, you might not recognize how much of a thing this is. It's shaped a significant part of our national conversation throughout the 21st century, and probably earlier too, though I'm not old enough to remember it. So again, if you're Canadian, you'll already get this, but if you're not, I want to paint a picture for you. It was early 2021, the height of COVID, so lockdowns were still in effect, and the vaccines for it hadn't yet been released. I'm sure wherever you're from, you felt the same fear, uncertainty, and anxiety that we did here. Lots of us worked from home, but those of us who couldn't and who weren't essential workers were paid by the government to do so through a program called CERB, the Canadian Emergency Response Benefit. A deeply imperfect solution, to be sure. I don't want to get into it, but I have no doubt it saved many lives. We looked south of the border and all collectively breathed a sigh of relief that we were at least better than the Americans. That's one of the biggest elements of Canadian nationalism, and it's really the only thing we can all agree on. We're not the Americans, and we're better off for it. In the wake of the murder of George Floyd by the police and the massive outpouring of opposition, many of us showed support, but we remained in that smug, at least we're better than those people, sort of attitude. We're the good guys, and our international reputation proves it. But almost exactly a year later, May of 2021, an archaeological team led by the Tk'emlúps-Te-Secwépemc First Nations used ground-penetrating radar and discovered the remains of 215 children buried in an unmarked grave at a former residential school near Kamloops, British Columbia. And again, if you're not Canadian, you might not realize what a deeply troubling moment this was for us as a nation. This shattered our national narrative. We're not the true North, strong and free, like our national myth tells us. We're a settler colonial project, and we need to reckon with the atrocities we've committed and continue to commit against the Indigenous peoples of this land. I look at Canada's national mythology not as a thing we are, but as a thing we should aspire to be. Kind, polite, and caring people who work to take care of each other and make the world a better place. It's sort of like the idea of being an ally to whatever marginalized group you're thinking of. These specifics don't really matter. It's not really something you can proclaim yourself to be. It's something you can commit to being. You prove yourself to be an ally, not through your words, but through your actions. I also don't think you can really understand Canada unless you understand our national mythology, how it's shaped the evolution of our culture, and how we failed to live up to it. In a sane world, guided by wisdom, Canada would have taken the discovery of the residential school mass graves as a realization we hadn't always lived up to our ideals, and that many of the original peoples who lived on this land before the rest of us got here suffered and continue to suffer today today because of that legacy. We'd use it as an opportunity to reflect on who we are, who we want to be, and how we can bridge the gap between those two going forward. And to be fair, some of us did, or at least we're trying to. But rather than accept the truth, some of us reject it altogether. They just can't accept that we've been, and in many ways continue to be, the baddies, no matter how much evidence shows up. They just can't let go of our cultural mythology. Like this jackass here. This is from the Canadian right-wing think tank, the Fraser Institute. For my American viewers, to put this in perspective, they're roughly comparable to the Cato Institute. Look at that smug prick. Look at that face. I bet he's got all sorts of terrible ideas in his head. Let's take a look at his Wikipedia page. Oh, Lord. Anyway, my point is, in many ways, history and mythology have always been interconnected. That was true in the ancient world, and it's true today. The mythology of ancient Greece and Rome is more obviously mythology than what we have today, but it is mythology nonetheless. And if we're going to get a nuanced understanding of civilization in the classical Mediterranean, we really can't throw the mythology away. So mythology is a part of the subject matter of this channel, and that's not going to change anytime soon. Chapter 2. The Lives of Teiresias. From a mythology perspective, so far we've looked at Hermaphroditus, who has only a couple of surviving sources, and Cyproites, who has only a single line referenced in an obscure poem. That made it pretty straightforward from a research perspective, but Teiresias might be one of the most prolific figures in all of classical mythology. They show up in a lot of different texts. Mythology, poetry, tragedy, comedy, satire, and even history, you'll find Teiresias in all of them. Name an ancient writer you know about and that most other people might know about as well. Homer, Ovid, Herodotus, Lucian, Sophocles, Euripides, Pindar, Pausanias, Plato, Aristotle. Even if you're not a classicist like me, I'm sure you've recognized at least a couple of the names I just mentioned. Teiresias is mentioned in each of these, and plenty more too. That makes analysis of this myth a lot more complex, but fortunately I'm not the first person to write about Teiresias. Scholar Luc Brisson, in his 1976 work Le Mythe de Teiresias, mentions 18 significant examples of mythological origin stories written around Teiresias. Just the origin stories, not the other stuff. He groups them into 3 broad overarching categories. However, Brisson argues that these 3 themes don't stand on their own, but are a harmonized, overarching tale of a complex liminal character. We'll be leaning on Brisson's work quite a bit for the initial myths of Teiresias, partially because it's one of the most complete sources I've found on the topic, and partially because I'm not that good at reading French, so it's taking me a lot of work to get through it, and I don't want to spend several months on this topic. Anyway, we'll explore these 3 overarching mythological themes and what they tell us about Teiresias' origins. From there, we'll explore some of the later stories of Teiresias, and then we'll take a look at what Teiresias can help us understand as modern trans people looking back. And away we go! Chapter 3. The first version of the Teiresias origin myth. This first story has the most sources for it, so we'll start here. But first, let's take a look at some of the sources we have on the first origin story of Teiresias. I'll do my best to be brief, but you know how I am.
Number 1. Phlegon's Mirabilia, Book IV.
We don't know a whole lot about this writer. You're going to get tired of hearing me say that pretty soon, and I'm going to get tired of saying it. So that's why I'm going to record it on my little button here. We don't know a whole lot about this writer. He was originally from the city of Tralles in Anatolia and was a libertus, a freed slave, who worked for the Emperor Hadrian. Hadrian ruled from 117 to 138 CE, so Phlegon lived around then. He wrote a bunch of different works, but most of it has only survived in fragments. His Mirabilia is the most complete work we have, but it's also incomplete. It's a sort of compilation of oddities, both human and otherwise, that he found throughout ancient literature. What sort of oddities, you ask? Centaurs, giants, the walking dead, ghosts, and of course, a bunch of stories of mythological transformations, including Teiresias.
Number 2. Hyginus Fabula.
Gaius Julius Hyginus lived in the 1st century CE in Roman-ruled Spain. There are two texts attributed to him, the Astronomica and the Fabulae. It's the latter that we care about today. Hyginus seems to have been a fairly well-regarded scholar, but the works attributed to him are pretty poor quality. They're full of errors, and the writing style is blunt and lifeless. Stuff like this, as bland as it is an important source for the preservation of some lesser-known myths. Of course, Teiresias is not a lesser-known myth, but, you know.
Number 3. Lactantius Placidus and Statius Oneida.
We don't know a whole lot about this writer. Lactantius Placidus is the name given to the writer of a critical analysis of Statius's Thebaid. It probably comes from around the 5th century CE. Oh yeah, and he talks about Teiresias. That's about it for this one.
Number 4. The Vatican mythographers Scriptores Rembum Mythicarum Latini, Book II.
Okay, first off, this one isn't even a classical text. It's medieval. What we collectively call the Vatican mythographers is the work of 3 different people. The names of 2 of them are unknown, and the third is thought to be Alberic of London, who lived in London and whose name was Alberic. Other than that, we don't know a whole lot about this writer. Like Hyginus, this one's just kind of like a summary of various myths. I don't want to just write these guys off like that, though, because in the medieval era there were 2 major obstacles to the preservation of classical mythology: widespread illiteracy and the church's hostility to anything pagan. So yes, they kind of Christianized these stories, but by doing so they were able to keep them alive in the popular culture of the time. That includes, of course, Teiresias. There are 3 different fragments of the Vatican mythographers we'll be using.
Number 5. Pseudo-Apollodorus' Bibliotheca, Book III.
This used to be attributed to Apollodorus, a 2nd century BCE Alexandrian writer, but that's probably not true. We now think it was written sometime in the 2nd century CE. It, too, is a compilation of mythology. It's sort of a greatest hits of Athenian tragedy, which of course includes Teiresias.
Number 6. Ovid's Metamorphoses, Book 4.
Ovid writing transgender mythology, biggest surprise in the world, I know. Was Ovid a chaser? Asking the real questions here. If you're new to the channel, we talk about Ovid all the time. Lived in Rome during the age of Augustus, wrote sad boy love poetry, and the Metamorphoses, which is full of mythological transformation stories. There's a pretty full biography of him in the main video on the Enarees, if you'd like to know more.
Number 7. Hesiod's Melancholia.
Hesiod is old. Like, really old. How old was he, Sophie? Hesiod's so old, he lives in a museum. Ba-dum-bum. Hesiod's so old, when he was born, they hadn't even invented history yet. Oh! Hesiod's so old, he's running for United States Congress. Damn! When it comes to the most influential mythological writers in the ancient Mediterranean, it's a toss-up between Homer and Hesiod. Both of them wrote around the same time. Both of them are the oldest sources for a lot of the most popular myths. The Melempodium might not have been written by Hesiod, but it was attributed to him, so we call it a Hesiodic poem. If you're familiar with the Homeric hymns, it's a similar idea. It survives only in fragments, including a tiny bit about Teiresias. There are a couple other Hesiodic fragments we're going to be using as well.
Number 8. Fabius Planciadis Fulgentius.
Has there ever been a name in history begging to be read in the Plinkett voice more than that one? Fabius Planciadis Fulgentius, or just Fulgentius, lived in North Africa in the late 5th or early 6th centuries CE. Recall that the Roman Empire in the West fell in the late 5th century, either 476 or 480 CE, depending on who you ask. So Fulgentius lived around the same time. He was a mythographer of minor importance, but he was popular during the early Renaissance, which is mostly why we know about him. Otherwise, we don't know a whole lot about this writer.
Number 9. Antonius the Brave.
If you watched the video on Sophroites, you might recognize this name. It's the only source we have on Sophroites' myth. It's only a single line. But if you didn't, here's a crash course. We don't know a whole lot about this writer. He wrote in Greek, but he had a Latin name. He probably lived after the reign of Antoninus Pius, the 2nd century CE, and he was clearly literate. Based on his name, we assume he was a former slave who earned his freedom, but that's all we know. His work is called the Metamorphoses, which is not the same as Ovid's Metamorphoses, or Apuleius' Metamorphoses, or Kafka's Metamorphosis, or Applegate's Animorphs, or Saban's Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, or it's mostly a summary of another lost work, which is also called Metamorphoses. It's a whole thing. Look at the name, Metamorphoses. It's clearly a collection of transformation stories, just like Ovid's work. So naturally, we find Teiresias in there too. In fact, the little bit we have about Teiresias from Antoninus Liberalis is the very same paragraph as the bit about Saproites, just 2 sentences later. Go figure. Okay, Sophie, enough already. Let's get to the stories. Come on, what the... The above sources all cover the first story, but each of them has different details involved. I'll do my best to more or less summarize what we have and to coalesce them into a single story, but we'll have to point out the differences as they come up. It's not ideal, but the other option is to tell the same story over and over with each variant, which seems a lot more boring. To make sense of this, I actually did something really embarrassing. I'm a little nervous to admit this. I don't know, it's pretty bad. I hope you don't think less of me after this. I guess I should just admit it. I made a spreadsheet. I know. I felt like an accountant. Anyway, look at this thing. Ugh, it sucked to put this together. But as we can see here, there are a lot of inconsistencies in this story. Some of them even leaves parts of it out. Hesiod doesn't mention the bit with the snakes at all, and Antoninus Liberalis doesn't mention the argument between Zeus and Hera, which is why those ones are grayed out. But here's the story as best we can pull from this. Teiresias was the son of Enarees, or Perier, or maybe some other guy. He was from Thebes, or maybe some other place. One day he was out for a walk, or grazing his sheep, or maybe doing something else, on Mount Selene, or Mount Cithaeron, or in a forest, or maybe somewhere else. As he did, he found some snakes doing it. He hit one or both of them with a stick, or stomped on one or both of them, or killed one or both of them, or otherwise injured one or both of them, and as a result, he turned into a lady. From there, she went on to live her life, having sex with a man at least once, for 7 years or 8 years or maybe some other length of time. Later, she found the same snakes in the same place, or the same snakes in an unspecified place, or different snakes in the same place, or different snakes in an unspecified place, or she didn't find any snakes at all because Apollo or an oracle told her where to go, or because she had a hunch, or maybe for some other reason. She hit the snakes in the same way, or she hit or killed the snake that she didn't hit or kill before, or she left them alone, or there were no snakes at all and this part didn't even happen, but regardless, she turned back into a man. Later, Zeus and Hera were having an argument that was playful or heated. Seems like those boomer wife bad jokes have also always existed. This time they were arguing about who enjoys sex more. Zeus was convinced that women enjoy it more, and Hera believed the opposite. So they figure, why not ask someone who's done both? Teiresias told them, if there are 10 parts of pleasure, women get 9 and men get 1. Or if there are 12 parts of pleasure, women get 9 and men get 3. Or if there are 19 parts of pleasure, women get 10 and men get 9. Or women enjoy it 3 times as much as men. Or women enjoy it more but by an unspecified amount. Whatever it is, Hera wasn't happy about it. She blinded him and cut off his hands, or maybe just blinded him, or otherwise injured him. They didn't say. Zeus felt bad about this, but he couldn't reverse what Hera did, so he gave Teiresias the gift of divination, and maybe also gave him a life spanning 7 generations. Yeesh. What are the through lines here? Teiresias was a man who was turned into a woman, then turned back into a man. Zeus and Hera argued over who likes sex more. Teiresias confirms women like it more, so Hera blinds him. The snakes don't always show up. The location is often different, and it's only mentioned once explicitly that she got busy with a man after, transforming into a girl. But the fact that he was consulted in Zeus and Hera's argument makes it obvious that she must have. I kind of love this story because it really shows you just how terrible the pagan gods were. Like, take a moment to imagine what must have been like for Teiresias here. Imagine God himself comes to you. Whatever God you're picturing, that's fine. The specifics don't matter. God himself comes to you. It's inarguably God, and you know it. There's no doubt. God asks you a question. He says he's having a disagreement with another God, and he wants your opinion. So what are you going to do? Of course, you're going to answer as honestly as you can. And the other God gets so mad at your answer, she gouges out your eyes. Talk about shooting the messenger. By the way, has anyone heard from Hermes lately? I hope he's okay. The world has always been a dangerous and uncertain place, but it was much more so in the ancient past than today. for most people. Regardless of how you prayed, how many sacrifices you made, how faithful you were to the gods, you might still suffer. Of course, that's true of Abrahamic religions as well, but if you're a follower of one of those religions, you can reassure yourself by saying it's all part of God's plan. For the Romans, and especially for the Greeks, sometimes you suffer because the gods are petty, juvenile, and vindictive. It doesn't matter how good a person you are, the gods are just awful. I guess I do get the rage, though. Zeus can be pretty petty, so I can imagine him jumping up and down, pointing at his wife, yelling, "I told you so, I told you so." Here's another fun bit. We know Zeus can transform into whatever he wants. He appeared as a swan, an eagle, a satyr, a golden shower. That's what the Greek says. It's a literal translation. Get your mind out of the gutter. It didn't mean the same thing. And even as Artemis, which Ovid tells us in Book 2 of the Metamorphoses. So why not just get down to business in disguise and see for yourself? But as we already saw, mythological stories contradict themselves all the time. But one of the big takeaways I think about with this story is Teiresias' wisdom was so widely recognized that even the gods came to them for advice. Their wisdom went so far beyond the mortal realm that even the most wise, powerful beings in the universe deferred to it. Wild to consider, huh? That living on both sides of the gender divide offers unique and valuable insights into the world that most people will never understand. Now, we know Teiresias was given the gift of divination, but what sort of divination to practice? How did that work for him? For that, we'll have to wait for the sequel. Chapter 4, Too Teiresias, Too Furious. Here we go, the beginning of the Greek mythology cinematic universe. I can't wait for the crossover event with Thor and Loki. And look, you can't sue me, Disney, because these are public domain characters. If you wanted to keep it locked down, you should have made up your own characters, like Steamboat Willie. Oh, what's that? Despite your incessant lobbying of the US government to extend copyright law, Steamboat Willie is in the public domain now, and we're watching it right now, and there's not a single thing you can do about it, despite having all the lawyers and all the money in the world? Oh, neato. Anyway, the second origin story of Teiresias. Let's take a look. We're not going to go through all the details of the authors this time. It took too long before. Instead, I'll just name. This time we've got Callimachus's Hymns, a Greek writer from Alexandria in the 3rd century BCE, Apollodorus's Bibliotheca, again, we talked about him before, Propertius's Elegies, a Latin poet from the Augustan era, the late 1st century BCE, Nonnus's Dionysiaca, a 5th century CE Greek epic poet from Roman-ruled Egypt, not the same as the Nonnus we talked about in the video on Pelagius, different guy. Just 4 writers this time. What do they tell us about Teiresias? Interestingly, they didn't really contradict each other. I did do another spreadsheet. Cringe, I know, but whatever, Gen Z, at least I know how to make one. Are spreadsheets chuggy? Wait, is the word chuggy chuggy? Damn. Anyway, some of the sources are pretty short for this story. The bit from Propertius is just a single sentence, so there's a lot implied, but not blatantly mentioned. The no's here aren't really contradictions as much as they are omissions, so this story isn't as much of a mess. I can tell a fairly clean version of it as a result. Broadly speaking, here's the story. Teiresias was the son of Enarees and a nymph, Chariclo. He was out for a walk one day with his dogs and was thirsty, so he stopped at the Fountain of the Horse on Mount Helicon near Thebes. But he didn't realize Athena was there bathing and ended up seeing her naked. And if you know your mythology, you know where this is going. No mortal was allowed to see any god naked unless the god wanted them to. If they did, they'd have to pay a heavy price. Athena didn't have a choice here. She had to do something about it, but Athena was besties with Teiresias' mother Chariclo, so she went as easy on him as she could, and blinded him. Chariclo shows up, hugs her son, and yells at Athena over it, demanding she undo what she'd done. Athena explains she didn't want to do it, but reminds her of Zeus's law. She can't undo it, no matter how much she may want to. But then she tells the story of Actaeon, who was transformed into a stag, and devoured by his dogs after seeing Artemis bathing. His mother would look at Teiresias and pray for her son to have a similar fate. Relatively speaking, he got off easy, but she'll give him the gift of prophecy, a magical staff to help him walk, and an unusually long life. What type of prophecy? Specifically, it's ornithomancy. Ornithomancy? Ornithomancy. It's ornithomancy. Teiresias can interpret the messages of the gods sent through the actions of birds. The Romans called this skill augury, and the practice was known as taking auspices, which is where we get the English words inauguration and auspicious. but it's a pretty similar practice to what the Greeks did. Neato. Now, did you notice a big difference between that story and the first one we looked at? That's right, Teiresias isn't turned into a lady in this version. Why not? It is something the gods were capable of doing. We saw that sort of with the first Teiresias myth, but it's much more clearly stated with the myth of Cyproites if you watched that video. If not, Cyproites' mythology survives in just a single line of poetry. Quote, "The Cretan Cyproites had also been turned into a woman for having seen Artemis bathing when out hunting." Clearly, Cyproites was in a similar situation and was punished as a result. We also have a few stories of women being transformed into men by the gods. Caenis, a woman, was transformed into Caeneus, a man, by Poseidon. Iphis was a girl raised as a boy who was turned into a man by the Egyptian god Isis. Leucippus' story is almost identical to Iphis, except it's Leto that does the deed. We learn about this one in the same story from Antoninus Liberalis that gave us the Cyproites bit. The difference is that this was considered a good thing. With Leucippus and Iphis, they marry a girl they're in love with and live happily ever after, and Caeneus becomes a tough-as-nails hero. They're all also asked for their transformations and receive them as a gift, a blessing from the gods, at least in most of their stories. Women turning into men is a good thing, but men turning into women? You've met with a terrible fate, haven't you? But Teiresias was being punished, so why didn't Athena turn him into a woman in this story? It could have something to do with Athena going easy on Teiresias, relatively speaking. In such a deeply misogynistic society, it might have genuinely been preferable to go blind than to be a woman. In terms of punishment-based transformations, though, we do have other examples to draw upon. There's the aforementioned Actaeon story. He discovered Artemis bathing and was turned into a stag and devoured by his own hunting dogs. There's also Calydon. This one comes from Pseudo-Plutarch's De Fluviis, where he tells us Calydon accidentally saw Artemis bathing in a river and so she turned him into a rock. I know whose fate would be the least worst for me, but to the ancients Teiresias got off easy. I guess that's one of the results of mythology being written exclusively by misogynistic men. From a wisdom perspective, we don't get as much here. It's an origin story for Teiresias' prophetic insights, but they aren't drawn upon. It does still provide more context for Teiresias' liminality, though. He straddles the world of the present and the future, the gods and mortals, and the blind and the seeing. Just not the world of genders. Chapter 5, the third origin story of Teiresias. This one only has a single source, so it's even more straightforward than the last. It comes from Eustathius of Thessalonica, a Byzantine writer from the 12th century CE. He wrote quite a bit, but his commentaries on Homer are what he's best known for. I'm using Brisson's French translation here. Eustathius tells us this story according to a writer named Sostratus, and apparently it's controversial which Sostratus he's referring to, but I really don't care to get into that. Regardless, it's a lost poem. Anyway, in this story, Teiresias was still the child of Chariclo, but she was born a girl. One day when she was 7 years old, she was out for a walk in the mountains, and Apollo had the hots for her, which, honestly, are you serious with this? I know there's a lot of weird junk in mythology, and I do my best to brush it off, but Apollo was after a 7-year-old girl? Ew, dude. I wonder if Apollo's in the Epstein files. So, Apollo's whole thing is that women aren't into him. Maybe he should be going after someone who's not a child then? Anyway, Apollo bargains with Teiresias, saying he'll teach her how to make beautiful music in exchange for it. Yeah. She accepts the gift, but then refused to sleep with Apollo, which, honestly, that's the right move. Young girl Teiresias is pretty clever. Apollo isn't happy about this, of course, so he turns her into a man. He's then tested by Eros, but the nature of that test isn't really clear. But regardless, he goes on to judge the quarrel between Zeus and Hera that we talked about in the first story. Then he turns back into a woman, somehow. It doesn't say how, just that it happened. Such a beautifully crafted mythos, how clever. As a woman, she fell in love with a man named Argos named Calon, and had a son with him named Strabo. He had that thing where your eyes point in like 2 different directions, which I just learned is called squint, because Hera was still big mad at her though. At some point, she saw a statue of Hera and mocked it, so Hera turned her into an ugly man, whom people called Python, which means little ape. Brutal. Zeus felt bad for him, so he turned him back into a woman, but an older one this time, where she went to Troitzen, a town east of Argos. Some guy named Glyphios had the hots for her and attacked her while she was bathing, but he was a wuss, it turns out, since he got his ass kicked by an older woman. She suffocated him. Poseidon wasn't happy about this because he loved Glyphios, so he asked the Fates to judge her. They turned her into Teiresias, and this is a weird way to phrase it because she was Teiresias the entire time, I thought, but the context isn't great here. The pronouns are inconsistent, and I'm reading it in French, which I'm not great at. I couldn't find an English translation, and my Greek is practically non-existent. I'm doing my best here. Anyway, I'm going to assume this means the Fates turned her into a man again. While they did it, they took away his gift of divination, which I guess he had the whole time, even though it hadn't been mentioned yet. He relearned it, though, from Chiron, who was the only centaur who wasn't a wild, untamed murder maniac, and is also considered a wise figure in Greek mythology. We talked about him before. After, he went to the wedding of Peleus and Thetis, where there was a beauty contest between Aphrodite and the three charities, Pasithea, Calais, and Euphrosyne. They have different names in other sources, but whatever, that's what they're named here. Teiresias was chosen to judge this contest. Hasn't he had enough trouble with the gods already? He chose Calais, who married Hephaestus. Aphrodite was upset by this, so she changed Teiresias back into a woman. Oh no, what a punishment! But this time an elderly one. Calais gave her beautiful hair and took her to Crete, where Spider-Man fell in love with him. Well, his name is Arachnos, but, you know, they did their business, and Arachnos started bragging that he'd slept with Aphrodite, which he obviously did not. This upset Aphrodite, so she turned him into a weasel. Fair, man sounds like he was a bit of one. But also she turned Teiresias into a mouse, which, what did she even do that time? So this is why mice are considered to be divining animals, I guess? This story is weird. There are no snakes, there's no blinding, there's no Athena, and Apollo serves a very different role. But in terms of major differences, there are two I'd like to take a look at here. First off, Teiresias starts off as a woman. From there, she goes through 7 different metamorphoses. 6 of them are changes in gender, and the final one is where she's turned into a mouse. But interestingly, there's still a parallel here. Because in the first story, Teiresias' life is extended. He lives for 7 generations. And in this story, she's transformed 7 times into each of the major age groups: child, girl, adolescent boy, young woman, man, middle-aged woman, older man, older woman, and mouse. Ah yes, the 7 genders. Teiresias does have their gift of prophecy as well, but it's just kind of vaguely brushed over. So Stratus might have gone into that in greater detail, but Eustathius' artless recap of the story doesn't really give us much to go on. But still, it's hard to argue Teiresias didn't have a wide variety of knowledge and experience after such a life, and their prophetic skills, such as they are still present. Teiresias still serves as a wise figure. It's also interesting to note that Teiresias is always in a marginalized position. Adult citizen men were really the only people who had any real rights in Greece. And when he was an adult man, he was so ugly that people thought of him as an ape, which is pretty rough. So this story clearly is really different from our 2 other Teiresias stories, but that's one of the things that makes it so interesting. Chapter 6. Teiresias in Epic Poetry Cycles. When it comes to mythology, there are a few cycles we talk about. These are tales generally told through epic poetry, relaying what might have been historical events, but heavily mythologized. The most famous of these is the Trojan cycle, sometimes called the epic cycle, the story of the prelude to the Trojan War, the war itself, and its aftermath. We've talked about this on the channel before. It's mostly fantasy, but we do know there was a city of Troy, it was destroyed, and there were Greeks present during its destruction. There were 8 poems in the Trojan cycle, and we have 2 of them, the Iliad and the Odyssey. But fortunately, we have enough sources talking about the rest of it that we can piece together a contiguous story. Probably the second most famous of these epic poetry cycles is the Theban cycle. This was made up of 4 epics: the Oedipodeia, the Thebaid, the Epigoni, and the Alcmeonis. Every epic poem we know of was related to one of these 2 cycles, or was about Heracles or Theseus in some way. We don't have any of the poems of the Theban cycle, unfortunately, just some fragments. It's the Oedipodeia that we're most interested in today. From what we can tell, it was around 6,600 lines of poetry and told the story of Oedipus. For comparison, the Iliad is 15,693 lines of poetry, and it's this long, at least in translation. Only a few fragments of the Oedipodeia survive, And from that we can pull out a couple of details that show us it's a different story than the better-known play Oedipus Rex by the Athenian poet Sophocles. But it's the best we've got, so we're going to explore that one now. The play opens with Oedipus, the king of Thebes, speaking to a priest with a group of children with him. The priest describes a great blight that has stricken their city. People are ill, the crops are growing, their animals are sick, and nobody can bear children. Creon, Oedipus's brother-in-law, enters. He'd just come from the oracle, who told him the curse is because the previous king Laius was murdered, and his murderer is somewhere in the city. They didn't have a chance to look into it at the time because a sphinx was terrorizing the city, but now they need to find Laius's murderer and deal with him if the city is to prosper once more. Oedipus is on board. He loves his city and his people. Besides, he's the king now, and whoever murdered the last king might want to come after him as well. There's always a chorus in Greek tragedy. It's a collective group of people that represented different things depending on the play. Here, they're a group of elder men of Thebes. Oedipus orders them to tell him everything they know about the murder, and they can't help because they don't know much, but the chorus leader suggests that Oedipus speak with wise old Teiresias. After all, Apollo clearly knows who the killer is. Oracles often speak through Apollo, and Teiresias can use his gift of prophecy to see what Apollo sees. Teiresias arrives, and things proceed. Quote,
Teiresias, you are well versed in everything, things teachable and things not to be spoken, things of the heaven and earth-creeping things. You have no eyes, but in your mind you know with what a plague our city is afflicted. My lord, in you alone we find a champion, in you alone one that can rescue us. Perhaps you have not heard the messengers, but Phoebus sent an answer to our sending, an oracle declaring that our freedom from this disease would only come when we should learn the names of those who killed King Laius, and kill them or expel from our country. Do not begrudge us messages from birds or any other way of prophecy with your skill. Save yourself, end the city, save me, save all of us from this pollution that lies on us because of that dead man. We are in your hands. It's a man's most noble labor to help another when he has the means and power.
Alas, how terrible is wisdom when it brings no profit to the man that's wise. This I knew well, but had forgotten it, else I would not have come here.
What is this? How gloomy you are now you've come.
Let me go home. It will be easier for us both to bear our several destinies to the end, if you will follow my advice.
You'd rob us of this gift of prophecy? You talk as one who had no care for law nor love for Thebes who reared you.
Yes, but I see that even your own words miss the mark. Therefore I must fear for mine.
For God's sake, if you know of anything, do not turn from us. All of us kneel to you, all of us here. Your suppliants.
The conversation continues. Teiresias the seer knows the truth. It was Oedipus himself who murdered Laius, his own father, though he didn't realize it. Then he arrived at Thebes, outsmarted the Sphinx, and as a result became king of Thebes, where he married the widowed queen of the city, Jocasta, his own mother. But how can Teiresias possibly tell Oedipus the truth? Oedipus continues to push him, eventually even claiming Teiresias himself must have done it. Otherwise, why would he keep this a secret? That's when Teiresias drops a doozy. Quote,
Yes, then I warn you faithfully to keep the letter of your proclamation, and from this day forth to speak no word of greeting to these nor me. You are the land's pollution.
Oedipus is furious, of course, but Teiresias reveals more of the truth to him, even as he presses the seer as much as he's able. He tells Oedipus it was him who killed Laius, and that he lives in the foulest shame unconsciously. It's Oedipus's fault that all these awful things are happening. Oedipus can't accept this, of course, and sends Teiresias away. Teiresias reminds Oedipus that he was invited, and it's not his fault the gods have such an awful fate in store for him. Of course, everything Teiresias sees eventually comes true. Oedipus discovers he did murder Laius, his father, and then marry Jocasta, his mother. Jocasta kills herself over it, and Oedipus gouges out his eyes. It's a bad ending. But Oedipus was the one who summoned Teiresias in the first place, and he did so because Teiresias was known to be a great seer. Oedipus tossed him out and rejected his insight, sure, but not because he was wrong. He just didn't like the answer he got. Talk about shooting the messenger. I wonder if Hermes wore a bulletproof vest. Anyway, this is the first example we've seen of Teiresias' gift of prophecy actually being used. And what does Oedipus say to Teiresias when he first arrives? You are well versed in everything, things teachable and things not to be spoken, things of the heaven and earth-creeping things. Teiresias lives between the world of the gods and mortals, and that's why he was summoned. He has insight into both. He's a liminal figure, yes, but this is one of the things that makes him so wise. His counsel is sought for this very reason. The tiny fragments we have of the Oedipideia do reveal a couple of key differences between it and Oedipus Rex. It's enough to tell us that these are two different interpretations of a story. Sophocles must have drawn on more than just the Oedipideia while writing his play, or he just took some considerable creative license. Either way, we can't be certain that Teiresias was even in the Oedipideia. We do have another source on the Theban cycle as well, though, that involves Teiresias. Statius's Thebaid. Publius Papinius Statius was a Roman writer of epic poetry who was born in 50 CE in Neapolis, modern-day Naples. His father was a poet who won some awards for his work, and son carried on in father's footsteps. He lived in Rome for a time, where he was a resident poet in the court of the Emperor Domitian, married a woman named Claudia, but had no children himself, and died around 96 CE. We talked about Statius in the video on Lucian and Megillus, which I know was a while ago and not a lot of people watched, but you should. It was an interesting video, I think. Anyway, he started writing an epic called the Achilleid about, you guessed it, Achilles, but by the time he died, he'd only finished the first chapter and a half. It's a shame, really, since it could have been a great source on Achilles. But his greatest work was the Thebaid, a 12-book poem that covers the events of the much earlier play also called the Thebaid. It's a story about the sons of Oedipus, Eteocles and Polynices. After the events of Oedipus Rex, Oedipus steps down as king of Thebes, and his sons agreed to take turns as king. Each would rule for a year while the other was exiled. Eteocles gets the first term since he's the older brother. When it's his turn to abdicate, he refuses, and Polydeuces prepares for war. Eteocles gets word that his brother is building an army and seeks advice on how to deal with it. And since he's in Thebes, who else would he ask but Teiresias? This time, Teiresias does something we've never seen him do before. He performs necromancy. It's a pretty elaborate ritual, but he's able to summon the spirits of a bunch of different figures, including poor Actaeon, who we talked about earlier. Most importantly, though, he summons Laius, the former king of Thebes, who Oedipus murdered. That would make him, this is a weird one. I guess he's like their step-grandfather, as well as their stepfather. This shows us another way that Teiresias serves as a liminal figure between the living and the dead. That's similar to how he serves in this other epic poem. Not sure if you've heard of it. It's called The Odyssey. In Book 11 of the Odyssey, Odysseus has been on his wanderings for quite some time. Originally, he led a fleet of 12 ships, but all but one of them had been destroyed at this point. He'd encountered the Lotus Eaters, Polyphemus the Cyclops, the Lystrogonian cannibals, and Circe the witch, who turned some of his men into swine. After leaving Circe's island, they visit the underworld, hoping to find some guidance on how to get home. When they do, they find none other than Teiresias, whose skills as a prophet are just as powerful in death as they were in life. He tells Odysseus that Poseidon has it out for him, which is one of the main reasons why he's had so much trouble getting home. From there, he essentially spoils the rest of the story for us. If Odysseus and his crew can avoid harming Helios's cattle when they find them, they'll get home safe. But if they do harm the cattle, their ships will be destroyed and everyone will be killed except Odysseus, who might still make it home, but in bad shape aboard someone else's ship. From there, he tells Odysseus how to appease Poseidon and how he can commune with the other spirits as well. So once again, we find Teiresias as a liminal figure, as a bridge between the living and the dead. Even in death, his wisdom is still valuable. Chapter 7. Other Tales of Teiresias. So at this point, we've talked about the main stories, but there are a couple other places he shows up as well. Let's take the time to trace these tertiary Teiresias tales. In general, he shows up to answer someone's question or to deliver a warning, for the most part. There's another scene in another Sophocles play, Antigone, that plays out largely the same as the one in Oedipus Rex. Antigone takes place after both Oedipus Rex and the Thebaid. In it, Antigone, the daughter of Oedipus, wants to bury her brother Polynices, but he's been shamed by Creon, the new king of Thebes and Antigone's uncle. Antigone insists, and Creon reacts to this like any reasonable person would do. He buries her alive in a cave. Teiresias arrives and says he has wisdom to share with Creon. Creon tells him he trusts his wisdom and his counsel, so Teiresias delivers the news. He warns that if Creon leaves Antigone underground and leaves Polynices unburied, one of Creon's own sons will die, and Thebes will be shunned by the gods. Of course, Creon gets mad about it, but eventually he agrees to follow Teiresias' advice. But at that point it's too late. Antigone is dead, and so is his son. Teiresias shows up in Ovid's Metamorphoses at another time as well, right after the transformation bit. The nymph Liriope asked him if her son would live to old age, and he said, yes, if he never knows himself. Her son, by the way, was Narcissus, and we all know how that one turned out. Teiresias does get to chill at least once, for a little bit, in Euripides' Bacchae. He and his old friend Cadmus, the founder of Thebes and retired king, are on their way to the mountains to join in exaltation to the god Dionysus. It's pretty adorable to imagine two old men dressed in zany costumes just walking to a festival, having a lovely day. But then Pentheus shows up, the big stinky jerk, the current king of Thebes. He's banned worship of Dionysus and orders anyone who engages in it to be put to death. Talk about a buzzkill. Teiresias and Cadmus continue on their way anyway, though. No young whippersnapper is going to harsh their vibe. In another case, Teiresias actually invented the practice of astrology. Lucian tells us Teiresias was the first one to figure out the gender of the planets and their influence on human activity. Who knew astrology was invented by a transsexual prophet? Of course, Lucian is best known for being a satirist, so take this one with a grain of salt. But in terms of his specific skill set, it seems like Teiresias is just kind of an all-purpose magical character with whatever skills happen to be needed for the moment. And because they've had so many different experiences, it never feels out of place. Instead, it just adds to Teiresias' place as a liminal figure. Chapter 8. What does this all mean? This isn't an exhaustive list of Teiresias' appearances, but for our purposes today, it doesn't need to be. It still demonstrates what Teiresias was as a mythological figure. As a prophet, Teiresias lived between the realm of the divine and of mortals. This also allowed them to live between the present and the future, for all the good it did for the people around them. As a necromancer, they lived between the realm of the living and the dead. This was true for them in life as well as in death. In the Odyssey, normally shades had to drink the blood of the living in order to recognize them. Even the shade of Odysseus' own mother couldn't recognize her son without doing so, but this wasn't a problem for Teiresias. They lived between genders, of course, having been both a man and a woman, and because their gifts came along with blindness, they stood as a liminal figure between the blind and the seeing, or to use a more modern language, between disabled and non-disabled people. They walk back and forth across many supposedly immutable barriers, and in doing so, they transgress the way things are supposed to be. These experiences provide them with so much wisdom that warriors, kings, generals, and even the gods consult them. Sometimes Teiresias is reluctant to provide such counsel. We saw that in Oedipus Rex. Nobody likes to be the bearer of bad news, but they do so when asked, nonetheless. So let's come back to the question I asked at the beginning of this video. What is wisdom? The field of philosophy has spent millennia grappling with ideas like this, so much so that the very word philosophy itself means love of wisdom. And that's not why I chose the name Sophie. I chose it back in high school, before I even knew what philosophy really was, but hey, I'm not complaining. Wisdom is hard to define, so much so that the lack of a consistent, all-encompassing definition of wisdom is practically a meme among psychologists and philosophers. If we ask Plato, he'd tell us one aspect of wisdom is a recognition of one's own ignorance, of how little one really does know about the world in which they live and the nature of reality. In the Apology, Socrates compares his wisdom with someone else's by saying, quote,
Well, although I do not suppose that either of us knows anything really beautiful and good, I am better off than he is, for he knows nothing, and thinks that he knows. I neither know, nor think that I know. In this latter particular, then, I seem to have slightly the advantage of him. Then I went to another who had still higher philosophical pretensions, and my conclusion was exactly the same.
His pupil Aristotle, on the other hand, differentiated between two different types of knowledge. First, there's Sophia, theoretical wisdom, which refers to deeper, more universal truths. Then there's phronesis, which is a more practical type of wisdom that helps guide your actions. As I mentioned at the beginning, I asked you all this question in a post on the channel recently, and many of you seemed to agree with Aristotle. It's some combination of theoretical knowledge and life experience. In the words of Terry Pratchett, wisdom comes from experience. Experience is often a result of a lack of wisdom. More recently, Carolyn Aldwin proposed a more universal definition of wisdom. Quote, "Wisdom is a practice that reflects the developmental process by which individuals increase in self-knowledge, self-integration, non-attachment, self-transcendence, and compassion, as well as a deeper understanding of life. This practice involves better self-regulation and ethical choices, resulting in greater good for oneself and others. Knowledge of self, integration of self, non-attachment, transcending oneself, and compassion." I don't know about you, but I feel like I can map my transition onto those steps. Knowledge of self. After a lifetime of feeling like things are not quite right, we go inward, we ask ourselves some difficult questions, and we come to realize the truth about ourselves. Integration of self. Perhaps after a period of denial, we begin to accept the knowledge we've gained about ourselves, and from there begin to adopt it into our personality. Non-attachment. Part of the integration process involves letting go of who we used to be, of how we navigated the world, of some of the privilege we may have held, of our intense need to control the outcome of our transitions. This takes longer for some than others to realize, but one's transition will play out the way it plays out. And like a dog on a leash, we do have some control over where we go, but much of it is out of our hands. The path to inner contentment as trans people is through changing what can be changed and learning to be at peace with what we cannot. The serenity prayer. God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and wisdom to know the difference. Transcending oneself. By leaving our previous selves behind, we sculpt our personas, our societal roles, and often our very bodies into what better suits us. For some, that means straddling multiple genders. For others, it's a hop from one side of the fence to the other. For still others, it's transcending the very idea of gender in the first place. Regardless, this is what it looks like to truly self-actualize, to reach the pinnacle of Maslow's classic hierarchy of needs. If Aldwin's definition is correct, and wisdom leads to better ethical choices and a greater good for society, is it any wonder so many trans people are so vehemently anti-fascist? Even if the power brokers of the world weren't currently using us as a scapegoat for the problems they're causing, I think that would still be the case. Another paper, this one by Nick Weststraight and Judith Gluck, spoke to different adults of different range of ages and determined wisdom comes from processing difficult life experiences. They also mentioned, and this jives with what everyone other than Plato told me, that wisdom comes from life experience. That's certainly been true for me. I've worked manual labor for minimum wage, and I've known billionaires on a first-name basis. I've built and sold businesses from nothing, and I've lost enough money to buy my house in cash. I've owned a 6-figure-a-year business, and I've been a few bad days away from being homeless. I've been a ghostwriter for a New York Times best-selling author in my 20s, and I've found myself living in my mom's basement in my 30s. I've been through and continue to go through experiences both awful and beautiful, and sometimes both. Life is a roller coaster. But I believe this breadth of experience gives me a unique insight into the world not everyone has. Consider the breadth of experiences you've had throughout your life. What sort of wisdom can you draw from them? Now combine that with your experience of having navigated the world as more than one gender. I know everyone experiences this sort of thing differently. Of course, my experience of being a man is different than that of a cis man's. Most of my experience with masculinity involved wanting to distance myself from it. If you're a trans woman, you know what I mean. But that experience still gave me a front row seat to the heights of toxic masculinity in a way most women never do. I've been privy to male locker room talk. I've witnessed boys will be boys type behavior. I've been bullied as a boy by other boy. I've heard the things men sometimes say to other men when they think women aren't listening. Maybe this is one of the reasons why toxic masculinity feels so threatened by transness. We're turncoats. We have access to knowledge women are forbidden to hold and can reveal that to other women. At the same time, I've seen how lonely and isolating masculinity can be. I've felt the yearning so many men have for real connection with each other and the internalized homophobia that prevents them from doing so. I know firsthand, in a way most women never will, how deeply patriarchy hurts men, even as some of them actively perpetuate it. I've also, of course, navigated the world as a woman, which I've been doing for more than 7 years as of this filming. I know how vulnerable it feels when a strange man follows us, and how heavily patriarchal beauty standards weigh on our shoulders. I never had the chance to be a young woman, but as I enter my 40th trip around the sun, I'm watching my youth begin to fade and struggling to embrace the latter half of my life in a way that men don't have to. How many famous women do you know that can embrace gray hair and still be a sex symbol in a way that George Clooney can, for example? I've seen the best and the worst of both men and women. In other words, I've seen some shit. If you're a binary trans person who's been at it for a while, you'll know what I mean, I'm sure. Non-binary is a little different since non-binary people are such a mixed bag, but there's wisdom to be had in that experience as well. If wisdom really is a combination of knowledge and experience, and if wisdom really does increase through processing difficult experiences, then trans people are by definition wise. Even if the world wasn't as hateful as it is, we'd still have the experience of navigating the world as a gender with which we do not identify, and be left with the burden of processing a lifetime of memories incongruent with who we are, which is challenging, to say the least. Cis people, of course, will never have this experience by definition. In a sane world, transness would be looked to as a source of wisdom and unique insight, just like Teiresias was. But of course, we don't live in a sane world, do we? We live in a world ruled by the basest of instincts, where the billionaire class pays their millionaire sycophants to spread hatred in the name of distracting from all the different ways they're screwing us, every one of us, every single day. Perhaps we can draw a certain amount of comfort from the idea that regardless of what nonsense the world spews, there are certain cultural constants. No matter who I spoke to on this matter, from all of you on this channel to my conservative old dad, I heard some variant of the same answer. Wisdom is, broadly speaking, a combination of knowledge and experience. Teiresias had both, and so their wisdom was widely known. You too, my trans sibling, have a deep wisdom our cis friends could never understand. And though we might not be viewed that way today in the popular culture, an objective examination of the concept of wisdom would, I believe, have to include us. Going inward, examining the parts of yourself you dislike, and deciding to be different, deciding to be better, deciding to take your life into your own hands. That's not something unique to trans people, of course. Our personal transformations may be more visually striking than most, but I've known cisgender people whose inner process of self-discovery and self-actualization has been just as profound. Even still, my trans siblings, we can stand as a visual monument to the breadth of human potential and of personal freedom. But beyond that, you and I, all of us, are a culmination of a glorious tradition of self-actualization through gender transcendence. Whether through HRT or becoming a priest of Kybele, there have always been people like us who understand when things aren't right and who take charge of their own lives. There's beauty in that. There's power in that. Take heart, my friend. We have always existed. And so long as humanity continues to endure, so too shall we. Thanks so much for watching, everyone. I hope you enjoyed this. As I'm editing this, I realized maybe I should have cut down on some of the tangents, but whatever, that's what happens when your trans historian has ADHD. Anyway, if you like this video, like it, leave a comment below and let me know what you think. And if you'd like to support the channel, you can join either Patreon or get a channel membership and join the ranks of these awesome people right here.